Everyone thinks Apple was always destined to win. The clean products, the loyal fans, the trillion-dollar valuation. But what if I told you Apple was 90 days away from bankruptcy? What if I told you the man who created Apple was fired from his own company? And what if I told you Apple's biggest comeback was triggered by a deal that looked like a public humiliation? This is not a tech story. This is a story about ego, power, failure, and one of the greatest comebacks in business history. Let's go back. In 1976, two guys named Steve were working in a garage. Steve Wozniak was a genius engineer. Steve Jobs was not. Jobs couldn't code. He wasn't technical. What he was obsessed. Obsessed with design, obsessed with control, obsessed with creating products people didn't know they wanted yet. The first Apple computers sold well. Then the Apple II exploded, and suddenly Apple wasn't a hobby company anymore. It was real. Money started pouring in. Investors showed up. Employees multiplied. And Steve Jobs? He was 21 years old, running a company worth hundreds of millions. That's when the problem started. Jobs was brilliant, but he was also impossible. He would humiliate employees in meetings, fire people in elevators, change his mind constantly. If he liked you, you were a genius. If he didn't, you were trash. The board got nervous, so they did something that would change Apple forever. They hired a real CEO, John Sculley, the guy who ran Pepsi, and Jobs personally recruited him with one of the most famous lines in business history. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to change the world? Sculley said yes. Big mistake. Jobs and Sculley started fighting for control almost immediately. Jobs wanted perfection, no matter the cost. Sculley wanted profits, structure, predictability. And when the Macintosh underperformed, the board chose a side. They chose Sculley. At 30 years old, Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple, the company he created, the company named after his idea. Gone. And here's the irony. Apple stock went up after Jobs left. People thought Apple had finally grown up. Steve Jobs? He was devastated. But he wasn't done. Jobs founded a new company called Next. The computers were beautiful, way ahead of their time, and way too expensive. Next failed commercially. At the same time, Apple was slowly collapsing. They launched product after product, too many models, no clear vision, confusing names, mediocre design. Microsoft was everywhere. Windows dominated. By 1997, Apple was losing $1 billion per year. Let me repeat that. $1 billion per year. Apple had 90 days of cash left. 90 days. That's when Apple made the most desperate decision in its history. They bought Next, which meant one thing. Steve Jobs was back, at first as an advisor, but everyone knew what was coming. Jobs walked into Apple and hated what he saw. Too many products. No focus. No soul. So he did what only Steve Jobs would do. He killed almost everything. Printers, cameras, random computers. Gone. He reduced Apple's entire product line to 4 products. Desktop, laptop, consumer, professional, that's it. People thought he was insane. But Jobs believed focus was power. Then came the moment that shocked the world. Apple needed cash, and their biggest enemy had it. Microsoft. So Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and announced a partnership with Bill Gates. The crowd booed. Apple fans felt betrayed. But Microsoft invested $150 million into Apple. Not because they loved Apple, but because Apple needed to survive. So Microsoft wouldn't look like a monopoly. That money saved Apple. And Jobs didn't waste a second. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac. Colorful, transparent, different, no floppy disk. People complained. Jobs didn't care. It's the future, he said, and it sold like crazy. Apple was profitable again. But Jobs wasn't aiming for survival. He wanted dominance. Then, in 2001, Apple did something unexpected. They entered the music business. The iPod wasn't the first MP3 player, but it was the first one that didn't suck. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Simple, emotional, brilliant. And then came iTunes. Apple didn't just sell hardware, they built an ecosystem. Buy music here, listen here, sync here, locked in. But the real earthquake came in 2007. Jobs walked on stage and said, "Today Apple reinvents the phone. No keyboard, no stylus, just a screen. The iPhone." Competitors laughed, BlackBerry executives mocked it, Nokia ignored it. Within a few years, they were dead. Apple wasn't a computer company anymore. It was a lifestyle company. When Steve Jobs died in 2011, people asked the same question. Is Apple finished? No more visionary, no more magician. But here's the truth. Jobs didn't just build products, he built a culture.